Clara Bennett stood at the edge of the kitchen counter, eyes fixed on the blackened scraps of her passport. Wisps of smoke curled lazily into the air above the marble surface, carrying the scent of scorched paper and betrayal. The charred remnants told her everything she needed to know. 2 years of dreaming, saving, and quiet planning had been destroyed in a matter of seconds. Her trip to Verona, carefully crafted to celebrate her 40th birthday and rediscover the art historian she'd once aspired to be, was gone, reduced to ash without a word of discussion. The realization settled heavily in her chest. She had spent countless evenings quietly studying Italian phrases, researching galleries, planning museum visits, all while Nathan watched television or scrolled his phone, never once asking about her plans. That silence, she now understood, had never been passive. It had been permission, granted only as long as her dreams remained small and her world stayed centered around him. Nathan, as always, appeared unaffected. He barely acknowledged the mess on the counter, more absorbed in the glow of his phone than in the fallout of what he'd done. Over the years, Clara had grown used to this casual disregard, the way he dismissed her interests as indulgent distractions. Her art supplies had vanished one by one, labeled as clutter. Friends had drifted away, subtly pushed aside under the guise of being negative influences. Even her phone had become communal property, checked under the pretense of curiosity, never of control. Now the final piece had fallen into place. Nathan wasn't just preventing her trip, he was replacing it. He had already arranged to go to Verona himself, traveling with his business partner and a woman Clara had heard of only through vague mentions and subtle lies. The messages Julia had sent her, the ones she had tried not to believe, suddenly felt painfully real. Isabel was no client. She was the destination. The damage was more than physical. It wasn't just the ruined passport, but what it represented. Her autonomy, her identity, her voice, all dismissed as unnecessary. The house around her, spotless and sterile, mirrored the version of herself Nathan had curated over 12 years of marriage, polished, contained, and silent. In that stillness something shifted. It was not rage nor even sadness, but a calm clarity that washed over her like cold water. Clara saw with startling simplicity that this moment was not an ending, but an invitation. The woman she had buried beneath compromise and compliance stirred inside her, steady and waiting. Without another glance at the scorched evidence of Nathan's control, Clara turned away from the counter. The weight of her decision had not fully settled yet, but she knew one thing with certainty. She would not stay. Not in this house. Not in this life. The silence she walked into wasn't emptiness. It was space to choose, to reclaim, to begin. Clara moved through the bedroom with deliberate calm, her body acting before her mind had fully caught up. The suitcase she had packed for Verona still sat in the back of the closet, untouched since she'd excitedly prepared it a week ago. She pulled it out slowly, her fingers tracing the smooth fabric, now repurposing it not for vacation but escape. The contents, summer dresses, guidebooks, neatly folded maps, were no longer relevant. One by one, she removed them and began replacing them with the things she truly needed. There was no plan, not yet. Only instinct. Important documents went in first: birth certificate, insurance papers, the spare ID tucked in her desk drawer. Next came the envelope of family photographs she had stashed years ago. Images Nathan once called clutter, when she tried to hang them in the hallway. She packed her grandmother's old jewelry, the ones Nathan had always dismissed as out of style, and her emergency credit card, long hidden inside the pages of a college textbook. It was a small act of foresight she once questioned. Now it felt like quiet rebellion. Clara moved efficiently, mechanically, as if muscle memory had taken over. Her heart was heavy but steady, her hands no longer trembling. The silence of the house, so often a source of tension, now gave her cover. Nathan had gone out, as he always did after dismissing her concerns, confident she would stay behind and fall back into the rhythms he had scripted for her. But this time there would be no return to routine. The decision had been made the moment she saw the charred passport. She would not rebuild from ashes in the same place that had reduced her to cinders. The only person she could think to call was Julia. Their friendship had never fully faded, though Nathan had tried to distance Clara from her too, claiming Julia was too emotional, too dramatic, too much. But Julia had always seen more clearly than Clara allowed herself to. Her texts, once ignored, now rang with terrifying accuracy. Clara scrolled to her number and hit call. When Julia answered, Clara didn't preface or explain. Her voice was quiet but certain. "He burned my passport." There was a pause on the other end. "Clara." Julia's tone held no judgment, only concern. "Are you safe?" "He's going to Verona. With her. And I can't stay here anymore." "Come. Now," Julia said without hesitation. "You can stay as long as you need." Clara ended the call with gratitude swelling in her chest. Not long ago she would have second-guessed even this small act, reaching out, asking for space, claiming help. But tonight she did not apologize. She zipped the suitcase, wrote a short note, and left it on the kitchen counter beside the blackened remains of her passport. She said nothing vindictive, nothing pleading. Only truth. Outside, the air was thick with the promise of rain. Clara stepped into the night without looking back. For the first time in years she carried only what truly mattered, and the growing knowledge that she was not broken, only beginning. The next morning, Clara walked into the bank with her chin lifted and her steps measured, projecting a calm she didn't entirely feel. The glass doors slid shut behind her with a soft hiss, separating her from the version of herself who had once believed she didn't need to understand finances, that trust was the same thing as security. Nathan had always handled their accounts, effortlessly, confidently, without explanation. He told her numbers weren't her strength, that it was better this way. For years she'd accepted that. Today she was rewriting the script. She approached the teller with purpose, sliding across her ID and stating the amount she wished to withdraw. It was half of what was in their joint savings account, an amount she had every right to access, though it felt almost unreal to say it aloud. The teller blinked at the figure, hesitated, then glanced at Clara with the quiet concern of someone trained to detect distress. Clara met her gaze steadily. "I'm leaving my husband today," she said, her voice even and controlled. The teller didn't ask any more questions. The transaction moved forward. Crisp bills and signed slips exchanged without fanfare. Clara tucked the envelope deep into her bag, not just as currency but as proof. Proof that she had a stake in everything Nathan had tried to claim as his alone. From the bank, she drove back to the house one final time. She timed her return carefully, knowing Nathan's routine. He would be at the gym, working through the morning like clockwork, oblivious to the fact that his control was slipping through his fingers. As she stepped inside, the air felt different, still intense, like a stage moments after the curtain falls. The house was in disarray. Drawers had been yanked open, cabinets left ajar. Papers were scattered across the kitchen table. It was clear Nathan had searched for something the night before. Documents, perhaps, or clues to her whereabouts. He hadn't expected her to act. He certainly hadn't expected her to leave. Clara moved swiftly, retrieving the last pieces of herself. In the linen closet, she found the manuscript of the novel she had once begun writing, hidden behind old towels. She slipped it into her bag, along with her mother's recipe book, a collection of memories in smudged ink and flour-dusted pages. In the bedroom, she paused only briefly, noting the absence of Nathan's suitcase. He still planned to leave for Verona, still believed he was escaping. Then in his office, she found the drawer that had always been locked now left ajar in his rush. Inside was a small safe, its door hanging open. What lay within sent a chill down her spine. A second phone, sleek and unfamiliar. She powered it on and within seconds, the screen lit up with messages. Dozens of them. Photos, emails, and texts, all from Isabel. Not from the past few weeks as she had feared, but dating back 2 full years. They spoke of longing, of shared plans, of a future that excluded Clara entirely. And worse, financial records, screenshots, account transfers, all carefully documented. The truth unfolded in her hands like a final verdict. Nathan hadn't just betrayed her heart. He had built an entire life in parallel. One she was never meant to uncover. Offshore accounts. Secret transfers. Funds hidden beneath layers of deception. She photographed everything, her hands steady now. Each click of the camera phone a quiet act of reclamation. When she stepped outside minutes later, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain and turning leaves. She walked down the path not as a woman betrayed, but as a woman finally awake. Clara hadn't just retrieved her possessions. She had recovered her power. Julia's townhouse was warm in a way Clara hadn't realized she'd missed. The living room was layered with mismatched pillows and vibrant throws, paintings leaning casually against walls, books stacked wherever space allowed. It felt lived in, expressive, cluttered with intention. Clara hadn't stepped into a home like this in years. Nathan preferred minimalism, symmetry, silence. Julia's home, by contrast, hummed with personality. It welcomed her like an old friend. They sat in the kitchen that evening, mugs of tea warming their hands as the storm outside deepened. Clara hadn't planned to say much. She'd intended to rest, to gather herself, to think. But the words came unprompted, raw and unfiltered, as if her body had been waiting for permission to speak. One memory at a time she laid it out. The subtle criticisms, the dismissals disguised as jokes, the slowly vanishing friendships. She spoke of how Nathan always had a reason, always wrapped his control in logic and charm. Over time she had stopped protesting. She had stopped noticing. Julia listened without interruption, her expression unreadable, her eyes steady and kind. When Clara finally stopped speaking, there was a moment of silence, heavy but not uncomfortable. "That's emotional abuse," Julia said softly. Clara flinched. The word seemed too sharp, too serious. She opened her mouth to protest, but the truth caught in her throat. It wasn't just about burned passports or lost trips. It was about the slow erosion of identity, about the way she'd been reshaped to fit into a life she hadn't built. The control hadn't been loud. It had been quiet, almost invisible. But it had been constant. "It didn't feel like abuse," Clara murmured. "It rarely does," Julia replied, "until it's almost finished its work." The truth of it settled over Clara, equal parts sorrow and relief. It gave shape to something she'd never dared to name. And in naming it, she felt the first edges of release. Later, when Julia had gone to bed and the house had gone still, Clara found herself drawn to the small art nook tucked beside the window. An easel leaned against the wall, surrounded by scattered brushes, tubes of paint, charcoal pencils. She hadn't drawn in years. Nathan had called it a hobby, something childish, something impractical. Eventually she had agreed with him, or at least pretended to. Now her hands reached instinctively for a charcoal stick. She sat at the table, the paper before her blank and expectant. She didn't think. She simply began. Lines formed, shaky at first, then more sure. A face began to emerge, familiar yet altered. It was her, but not the version Nathan had shaped. The eyes were sharper, the jaw firmer, the expression quietly resolved. When she finally stopped drawing, Clara sat back and looked at what she had created. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It was hers. For the first time in years she felt herself beginning to return. Not as a wife, not as a version of someone else's ideal, but as herself. Clara was beginning to remember who she had always been. Clara heard the doorbell before she saw the headlights cut across the wall of Julia's living room. She didn't need to look to know who it was. The weight of Nathan's presence had always preceded him, subtle and suffocating. Julia appeared at the top of the stairs, her face tight with concern, but Clara held up a hand. "Let me handle this," she said quietly. "I need to do this myself." Julia hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be just upstairs. Call if you need anything." She disappeared without another word. Clara walked to the door with a slow, deliberate pace. Her hand hovered over the handle for only a moment before she opened it. Nathan stood on the threshold, impeccably dressed as always, though the mask of calm control he usually wore was visibly cracked. His eyes were sharp, narrowed with the irritation of someone unused to being defied. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "Do you have any idea how childish this is?" he snapped, his voice low but brimming with restrained fury. "You humiliated me. I had to cancel meetings, explain your little tantrum to people who don't need to know our business." Clara said nothing at first. She watched him pace, watched the lines of his face settle into familiar patterns of disdain and condescension. For years, those expressions had made her shrink. "Not tonight." "I know about Isabel," she said, her voice steady. Nathan stopped mid-step, the color draining slightly from his face. "I know about the other phone. The messages. The photos. The plans." He recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. "You went through my private things?" he said, attempting outrage. "That's a new low, Clara." "No," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "The low was you erasing me from your life while pretending to keep me in it." She took a step closer, her voice calm but firm. "I also know about the offshore accounts. The money you moved without telling me. The fake investments. I took photos of everything." Nathan's jaw tightened. "You don't understand how any of this works. Business is complicated. You were never involved for a reason." "I wasn't involved because you made sure I stayed ignorant. But I understand enough now," Clara said. "Enough to know you've been lying. To me, to your partner, probably to your clients too." "I've been under a lot of pressure," he began, his tone shifting, reaching for the familiar excuses. "We've both made mistakes." "I'm filing for divorce," she interrupted, the words landing like a stone dropped into still water. "The papers are being prepared. I've already withdrawn my share of our savings." Nathan's expression darkened. "You think you're entitled to half? That business is mine. Everything we have, I built it. With my inheritance," Clara said evenly. "Money you used to start your company. Money I trusted you with. And the house? My name is on the deed. Your business partner's wife is upstairs, ready to testify to your affair. How do you think this looks in court?" Nathan stared at her, truly looking at her for the first time in years. There was something unfamiliar in his eyes, confusion, perhaps even fear. "Who are you right now?" he asked. Clara didn't hesitate. "Someone you never bothered to see." In a sudden movement, he reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers pressing into her skin. "You don't know what you're doing," he growled. "You think this is a game?" Before Clara could respond, Julia's voice rang out from above. "Everything okay down there, Clara? Want me to call the police?" Nathan let go immediately, the shift in his demeanor almost theatrical. He smoothed his sleeves and straightened his posture. "There's no need for that," he said loudly. "I was just leaving." He turned to Clara, voice dropping again. "This isn't over." "Yes," Clara replied, opening the door wide. "It is." He stepped out into the night, the door closing behind him with finality. Clara stood in the silence that followed, her breath unsteady but her spine straight. Julia rushed down and wrapped her in a tight embrace. "You did it," she whispered. Clara nodded, emotion rising in her throat. For the first time she felt what it meant to stand up. Not just to Nathan but for herself. The phone rang just after late morning sunlight had begun filtering through the gauzy curtains of Julia's kitchen. Clara, still wrapped in the quiet of the house and the aftermath of the confrontation with Nathan, hesitated before answering. The number was unfamiliar, and her first instinct was to ignore it. Since walking away, she had received a flood of messages, some from acquaintances offering vague sympathy, others from Nathan's circle, urging her to come to her senses. But this number didn't match any she recognized. Curiosity edged out caution. The voice on the other end was clear and composed, unfamiliar yet precise. The woman introduced herself as Isabel Hart. The name landed with weight. For weeks it had hovered like a shadow, an unspoken confirmation of everything Clara had feared. Isabel, the woman Nathan had planned to take to Verona, the woman he had chosen to replace Clara. But the voice on the line was not what Clara expected. There was no defensiveness, no condescension, just a request to meet and a quiet promise. "It's not what you think." Later that afternoon, Clara sat at a tucked-away table in a quiet cafe far from Julia's neighborhood. The choice of venue had been deliberate. A place neutral, private, safe. When Isabel arrived, she did not match the image Clara had conjured. There was no theatrical glamour, no lingering sense of seduction. She looked like someone from a boardroom. Sharp suit, purposeful eyes, a quiet confidence that suggested competence more than charm. Once seated, Isabel spoke with little hesitation, but without embellishment. She was not Nathan's lover. She was a financial investigator, assigned months ago to look into his business after a series of financial anomalies triggered internal alerts. The persona of Isabel, as Nathan knew her, had been constructed to gain proximity, to see beyond the carefully constructed facade of legitimacy. Clara listened without interruption as the pieces began falling into place. The late meetings, the secrecy, the bursts of tension followed by forced charm. It hadn't been just an affair or a midlife crisis. It had been criminal. Nathan had been running an elaborate Ponzi scheme for years, using incoming investments to pay existing clients while quietly siphoning millions into offshore accounts. The lifestyle Clara had grown accustomed to, the beautiful house, the designer furniture, the expensive dinners she had never asked for, wasn't just excessive. It had been built on deception. The final blow came with a warning. Nathan had drained the primary business account the day after Clara left, and was likely preparing to disappear. He intended to flee to a country without an extradition treaty, using stolen funds and a false narrative of marital abandonment. And Clara, as his wife, whether knowingly involved or not, might be scrutinized as the investigation unfolded. The realization settled slowly, not with panic but with a chilling clarity. Clara had always known her life with Nathan was tightly controlled, but now she saw the purpose behind it. His insistence on handling the finances, discouraging her career, isolating her from friends. It had never been about domestic order. It had been about concealment. As the meeting ended, Isabel offered her professional contact and a quiet affirmation of Clara's innocence, but Clara already knew what she had to do. She would not let herself become collateral damage in a life she hadn't chosen. The truth was finally exposed, and it was uglier than she imagined. But she wasn't afraid of it anymore. She had already walked away from Nathan's illusion. Now she was ready to face what came next. With open eyes and a steady hand, Verona welcomed her not with grandeur, but with quiet promise. The air felt different, lighter, even in late autumn. Clara arrived with a single suitcase, an emergency passport, and no concrete plan beyond escape. The city, centuries old and humming with life, wrapped around her gently. For the first time in weeks, perhaps years, she felt no pressure to speak, to explain, to perform. She had left behind the scorched debris of a false life and come here not to hide, but to begin again, even if she didn't yet know what that would look like. Her hotel was modest, tucked into a narrow street just beyond the city's historic center. The room was small, sparsely furnished, and utterly perfect. From her window, she could see the terracotta rooftops and hear the muffled cadence of foot traffic below. Verona was alive in a way Clara hadn't felt in herself for years. She began her days early, often walking without a destination, letting herself be drawn into quiet churches, small museums, and sunlit courtyards. She found herself lingering in galleries longer than she expected, pulled not just by the art but by a longing that stirred deep within her, something she had buried beneath years of compliance. Her sketchbook, long forgotten, now lived at her side. At first she filled it hesitantly, lines unsure, shading uneven, but over time her hand grew more confident. She sketched fragments of architecture, studied faces and sculptures, copied the gentle folds of fabric from Renaissance frescoes. She didn't draw for praise or perfection. She drew to remember who she had been before she'd been silenced. One evening, while dining alone at a small trattoria nestled near the Adige River, she caught the attention of the owner, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and a quiet reverence for art. His name was Marco Rossi. He noticed her sketching between courses and paused to look over her shoulder. What began as a casual compliment soon unfolded into conversation, and then connection. Marco introduced her to his daughter Alessia, a professor of art history at the local university, who arrived the next evening with a kind of energy that filled a room effortlessly. Alessia's passion for art was infectious. She asked thoughtful questions, listened with interest, and made no effort to hide her enthusiasm when Clara hesitantly admitted her past studies in art history and her recent efforts to draw again. The two women met several times in the days that followed, wandering galleries and discussing restoration techniques over espresso in sun-drenched cafes. Alessia spoke of a special program at her university, an intensive 6-month course in art restoration, designed for international students and those returning to study after life interruptions. There was even a scholarship, she said, offered specifically to women rebuilding their lives after significant personal upheaval. Clara's first instinct was to deflect. She wasn't ready. She wasn't qualified. She was too old to start over. But Alessia, perceptive and firm, dismissed those doubts with a gentle certainty. Verona, she said, had been destroyed and rebuilt many times over its long history. If a city could do it, so could a woman. That night, back in her hotel room, Clara sat on the edge of her bed with the application in front of her. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of the decision. For so long she had lived reactively, adjusting to Nathan's moods, tiptoeing around his control. Now she was free to choose for herself, to say yes to possibility. With the steady scratch of her pen against the paper, Clara filled out the application, each answer a declaration. I am still here. I still want something for myself. She didn't know if she would be accepted, but she knew this. She had already begun to return to life. The call came on a quiet afternoon, the kind where time moved gently and the light settled softly against the stone walls of Clara's small hotel room. She answered it without expectation, prepared for polite disappointment. But instead of a rehearsed apology, she heard Alessia's voice laced with restrained excitement. The committee had reviewed her application. They were impressed, not just by her portfolio, but by her story, her honesty, her clarity of purpose. She had been awarded the scholarship, full tuition, a modest stipend. Classes would begin the following month. For a long moment Clara didn't speak. Gratitude swelled in her chest, too large to express in words. This opportunity, this second beginning, felt almost too much to accept. Not because she didn't want it, but because she had spent so long convincing herself that doors like this didn't open for people like her. She had lived quietly beneath someone else's expectations, losing bits of herself in the name of harmony. Now, for the first time in years, a door was opening because of who she was, not despite it. She moved into a small apartment near the university. It was modest but filled with natural light, and its single balcony overlooked the rooftops of the old city. There was just enough space for a table, a chair, and an easel. It was all she needed. The scholarship allowed her to focus entirely on the program, an intensive blend of history, technique, and precision. Each morning, she stepped into the restoration lab like a ritual. The room smelled faintly of turpentine and aged wood. The walls were lined with faded canvases awaiting new life. In the beginning, Clara felt out of place. Her fellow students were younger, some fluent in Italian, others already working toward advanced degrees. She entered with a quiet deference, unsure of where she belonged. But as the weeks passed, her confidence deepened. Her hands, long unused, remembered their rhythm. Her eyes grew attuned to subtle details. Cracks in varnish, shadowed layers of paint hidden beneath time and grime. Restoration, she learned, was less about erasing the past and more about honoring it. The process required patience and trust. In the materials, in the original artist, and in oneself. There was beauty in the imperfections, meaning in the effort to preserve what had once been nearly lost. It mirrored her own transformation. She had come to Verona feeling broken, unsteady, unsure of her shape in the world. But day by day she was rebuilding. Not into someone new, but into the woman she had always been beneath the silence. There was no rush. Healing, like restoration, was a meticulous craft. Some evenings she stayed in the studio long after class had ended, quietly working beneath the soft hum of overhead lights. Alone with a brush and a canvas faded by time, Clara no longer felt like a shadow of herself. She felt whole, carefully, slowly, gloriously restored. Clara hadn't planned to see Nathan again. In the weeks since his arrest, she had focused entirely on building a new rhythm, one shaped not by reaction but by intention. But some things remained unfinished, lingering like a faint echo behind even the most hopeful days. Despite the progress, despite the sense of peace slowly taking root in Verona, there was a part of her that knew she would never be entirely free unless she looked him in the eye and walked away on her own terms. The detention center was stark and colorless, its walls scrubbed clean of anything human. Clara waited in a small sterile room beneath the hum of fluorescent lights, her hands folded calmly in her lap. When the guard let Nathan in, she barely recognized him. Gone was the polished businessman, the man so carefully put together. He looked smaller now, thinner, and not just in body. The absence of his tailored suits, his curated life, revealed something hollow. For the first time, Clara saw him without the illusion. He sat across from her, a hint of surprise flickering across his face. She could sense him searching for the version of her he remembered, the compliant, quiet wife. But that woman was gone. The silence between them stretched long before he finally spoke. His voice had lost its confident edge, as if unsure how to reach her. "You look different." Clara didn't respond. She waited. "I always thought Verona would suit you," he added. The comment might once have unsettled her, but now it felt like static. He hadn't brought her here. She had brought herself. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I never meant for it to turn out like this. I loved you in my own way." She let the words hang in the air without acknowledgement. There was no comfort in them, no apology, only a faint attempt at rewriting the past. "I need to ask you something," she said finally. "Why did you marry me?" Nathan hesitated. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of the table, his eyes darting away before he met her gaze again. When he spoke, his voice was low and almost wistful. "You were real, unfiltered. You had something I didn't. I thought if I could keep you close, I could have that too." He paused. "But I didn't know how to live with it, so I tried to perfect it instead." Clara took in the words without emotion. They didn't bring closure, not really. But they offered a glimpse into the man she had spent 12 years trying to please. He had never loved her as a partner, only as a symbol. Something to own, to polish, to control. "I didn't come here for explanations," she said quietly. "I came to say goodbye." Nathan opened his mouth to respond, but she continued. "I'm not your victim anymore. I'm not your shadow or your project. I'm not someone you get to define. Something in his expression shifted, just slightly. Not regret, not sorrow. Something more like recognition. For the first time, he seemed to realize that she was no longer within his reach. "You won't visit again?" he asked. "No." As the guard stepped forward to escort him out, Clara stood. She didn't look back. Her footsteps echoed down the hall, each one steadier than the last. Outside, the air was crisp and clear. She drew a breath deep into her lungs. The final thread had been cut. Whatever came next was hers alone to choose. Clara returned to Verona as winter gave way to early spring, the city slowly thawing under a gentler sun. The streets she had first wandered in quiet urgency now felt familiar beneath her steps. Not just a refuge, but a place of becoming. She carried with her a kind of stillness, not numbness but a grounded presence. What had once been survival had transformed into rhythm. A quiet morning routine, hours of study and practice in the restoration lab, evenings sketching on her small balcony, where the rooftops glowed terracotta in the golden hour. She painted often now, not for anyone else, not for display but for herself. The small apartment she had rented was lined with canvases in various stages of progress. Some were simple studies in light and shape. Others were more abstract, raw and expressive, like bursts of emotion transferred into color and texture. The city gave her permission to be many things at once. Focused and unsure, disciplined and emotional, healing and unfinished. For the first time in years, Clara no longer felt the need to explain her contradictions. She was learning to live with them, to let them exist without apology. Her days were filled with tactile purpose. The process of restoring art, gentle cleaning, layering pigment, repairing what had been fractured, mirrored her own journey more than she had expected. Each brushstroke was an act of patience. Each recovered detail, a quiet affirmation that time did not erase value. That broken did not mean ruined. She found solace in the delicate work, in the silence of concentration, in the knowledge that she was helping something endure. The people around her became part of her renewal. Marco, always warm and observant, insisted she eat at the trattoria at least once a week, usually slipping her an extra dessert with a wink. Alessia continued to challenge and encourage her, her mentorship never prescriptive but rooted in belief. Professor Mancini, once a distant figure, now greeted her with quiet nods of approval in the studio. Together they formed something Clara had never expected to find so far from home. A chosen family. One evening in early March, Clara stood on the balcony holding a small glass of wine, the crisp air tinged with the promise of spring. The day marked a quiet anniversary, 1 year since she had found her passport reduced to ash on her kitchen counter. 1 year since everything she thought she knew about her life had been torn away. The woman who had stood in that kitchen had been afraid, uncertain, barely holding herself together. And yet, that moment had been the beginning. The end of silence. The beginning of truth. Instead of mourning what had been lost, Clara marked the day in quiet celebration. She invited Marco, Alessia, and a few fellow students to her apartment. They filled the small space with laughter, mismatched plates of food, and music that drifted from an old speaker. There were no speeches, no candles, no acknowledgement of the date. But Clara felt it in the way they looked at her. Not as someone fragile or broken, but as someone whole, present, alive. Later that night, when the others had gone and the room had fallen into stillness again, Clara walked to her easel. She began a new painting, not from memory or study, but from instinct. The colors came easily, flowing across the canvas in confident strokes. She didn't worry about what it meant or whether it would be good enough. It was simply hers. As she worked, a soft breeze drifted through the window, carrying the scent of distant blossoms. Verona breathed around her, timeless and steady. Clara paused, brush in hand, and smiled, not at what she had accomplished, but at what she had allowed herself to begin. This was not the life she had once imagined. It was better, real, imperfect, and entirely her own. The soft chime of the bell above the studio door had become a familiar comfort to Clara. A daily rhythm she now moved within effortlessly. Her days no longer felt borrowed, they belonged to her. The scholarship program was entering its final weeks, and the transformation within her was unmistakable. What had once felt foreign, the careful techniques of cleaning centuries-old pigment, the delicate reconstruction of flaked paint, the reverent touch required to preserve someone else's creation, now came naturally. Her instructors no longer hovered. Her classmates no longer offered corrections, only camaraderie. She was not just surviving this chapter. She was mastering it. Her small apartment had grown around her like a second skin. What had begun as a neutral, temporary space had quietly filled with traces of her presence. Paint-splattered canvases leaned against the wall, some finished, others mid-bloom. Drying lavender hung above the sink, a gift from a neighbor. Flowers from Marco arrived without fanfare, tucked into old glass bottles she kept on the windowsill. Postcards and event flyers gathered on the fridge, reminders that her life was no longer a blank slate, but a mosaic of choice. Then came the final assignment. Professor Mancini introduced it with quiet reverence. A damaged fresco tucked inside a forgotten chapel just beyond the city's edge. The piece was modest in scale but carried historical weight. The restoration would require everything Clara had learned: chemical precision, artistic intuition, and emotional restraint. She visited the chapel alone before the others, walking slowly through the narrow nave until she reached the wall where time had left its fingerprints. The fresco had once depicted a scene of healing, hands outstretched, light spreading from a central figure. But now it was faded, fractured, barely legible beneath centuries of wear. Clara stood in silence for a long time. There was something unspoken in the space between her and the wall, a quiet recognition. It mirrored her own history, not erased but layered, obscured, waiting to be carefully uncovered. She ran her gloved fingers gently along the plaster, imagining the hands that had first painted it, the years it had waited to be seen again. This wasn't just a final project. It was a reckoning. Back in the studio, Clara prepared her materials with steady hands. As she measured solutions, documented surface damage, and began preliminary sketches, a quiet certainty rooted itself within her. This was no longer about proving anything. It was about honoring what had endured. For the first time since she had left everything behind, Clara didn't feel as though she was piecing together a broken life. She was building something new, something deliberate and alive. And it didn't have to be grand, just had to be real. Each day spent beneath the soft light of the chapel became a meditation in becoming. The restoration would take weeks, but Clara was in no rush. For the first time in years, time no longer felt like a burden. Felt like a gift. The email came on a quiet Thursday morning, just as Clara was preparing her tools for another day at the chapel. Alessia had forwarded it with a brief note. "This is worth reading. Think about it." The message itself was from a prominent arts foundation based in New York, the Corwin Institute for Restoration and Cultural Preservation. They were offering a year-long residency for mid-career restoration artists with unconventional paths, and Alessia had submitted Clara's name without telling her. Clara sat at the small kitchen table, rereading the offer several times. It was everything she had once dreamed of: full funding, access to major collections, mentorship from world-renowned conservators. The kind of opportunity that could re-establish her in the field professionally, placing her not only back on the map but at the forefront. There would be lectures, exhibitions, curated projects, visibility, validation. But it wasn't just an offer. It was an invitation to return. And that was the part she couldn't ignore. New York was just a short flight from everything she had left behind. Her sister Hannah, who had welcomed her in those shaky early days after she fled, the apartment where she had hidden while the media swirled around Nathan's arrest, the courthouse where her divorce had quietly finalized, her presence waived. And now, months later, Nathan's trial was approaching. Journalists had begun reaching out again. Online forums speculated about what Clara had known, what she had benefited from. Some defended her. Others didn't. If she returned, she would no longer be protected by the soft anonymity of Italian streets or the quiet respect of her instructors. Her face, her name, her story would resurface in a country that hadn't watched her rebuild. It had only seen her collapse. She walked to the balcony and leaned against the iron railing, the Verona skyline unfolding around her in warm, familiar tones. Below, a couple laughed over morning espresso. In the courtyard, a child kicked a ball against a faded stone wall. This city had taken her in without question. It had offered her rhythm, silence, and the gentle space to become herself again. It was safety, but safety that did not suffocate. Safety that had allowed her to choose. Clara returned inside and reread the email, this time imagining what it would mean not just to go back, but to go forward. The offer wasn't a lifeline. She no longer needed one. It was a platform, an elevated space from which she could stand, speak, and be seen not as someone fleeing a past, but as someone with something to offer. Her restoration work had already proven her resilience. This would be her chance to shape what came next. Still, she hesitated. Part of her questioned whether leaving Verona meant abandoning what she had only just begun to build. Would stepping into the spotlight reopen old wounds? Would she once again be reduced to the story of a disgraced man's wife? She didn't want to be defined by reaction anymore. Not to Nathan. Not to circumstance. She wanted her work to speak. Her hands, her choices, her voice. Clara closed her laptop and rested her palms on the table. There was no rush. The decision didn't need to be made today. But already something had shifted. This was not the kind of fear she used to feel, the fear of disappearing, of being erased. This was a new kind of fear, the fear of being seen, of standing fully in the light. And for the first time, it didn't make her want to run. It made her want to rise. It began with a voicemail. The tone was professional, almost apologetic, but its contents sent a chill through Clara that she hadn't felt in months. A journalist from a national investigative outlet had reached out, requesting a statement. The piece, she explained, would focus on the victims of Nathan Bennett's financial crimes, those who had lost retirement savings, college funds, inheritances. The fallout had been wide and devastating. Clara's name had surfaced in the research. The journalist claimed she wanted to offer Clara the opportunity to share her side of the story. Clara let the message sit unheard for days. Even after transcribing the words in her journal, she wasn't surprised. She had known the past would catch up eventually, but still it unsettled her. How quickly her peace could be disrupted by a voice she didn't know. Then came the article. A well-known former investor, a man in his 60s who had once trusted Nathan with the legacy of his small family business, had spoken out. He had lost nearly everything. And in the midst of his grief, his fury found Clara. She lived in the house. She traveled on the stolen money. "You don't stay blind for 12 years without choosing to," he was quoted as saying. The words hit harder than she expected. Even though they came from a place of pain, even though they weren't entirely fair, they cut into the part of her that still questioned, had she been blind? Had she chosen silence, comfort, the illusion of stability? Had she enabled Nathan by believing in him for so long? She found herself staring at her reflection in the studio's bathroom mirror one afternoon, paint still streaked across her sleeves. The woman looking back was different, clearer in the eyes, more certain in her posture. But the echo of the accusation clung to her skin. She had worked so hard to rebuild. Had she only managed to outrun the wreckage? Clara spoke to Alessia, hoping for clarity. Alessia didn't offer platitudes. Instead, she asked the question that mattered most. Do you want to be part of the story someone else is telling? Or do you want to tell your own? The choice weighed heavily. Remaining silent meant preserving the fragile peace she had built. She could let the article fade, allow the narrative to move on without her. But it also meant forfeiting the chance to correct the record, to speak not just for herself, but for every woman who had lived in someone else's shadow and been blamed for it. To speak meant vulnerability. It meant exposure. It meant stepping fully into the light, not as a victim, not as a bystander, but as someone who had once been complicit in her own silencing and who had chosen deliberately to leave. Clara closed her journal that night with a steady hand. She hadn't made a final decision yet, but she knew one thing with certainty. She wasn't the same woman who had once been afraid to ask questions. And if she spoke, it would not be to defend herself. It would be to reclaim herself. Clara stood on the sun-drenched platform of Verona's train station, the city behind her softened by spring light. When Julia stepped down from the carriage, their embrace was quiet but full. A recognition of time passed and distance closed. The years had changed them both, but what remained was something steadier than time. Shared history, the kind that no amount of silence or upheaval could undo. As they walked through the winding streets toward Clara's apartment, the rhythm of the city welcomed Julia gently. The muted colors of old stone, the burst of geraniums in window boxes, the way conversations curled through alleyways. It all wrapped around them like a quilt. Clara had prepared a small guest room filled with personal touches. A vase of local flowers, a linen robe folded on the bed, and a handwritten list of nearby cafes. It was not just a place to sleep, but a gesture. A quiet invitation into Clara's new life. In the days that followed, the two women moved through Verona at a relaxed, thoughtful pace. They visited churches, wandered markets, and spent long afternoons in quiet museums. Clara found herself talking about the restoration process more than she expected, describing how each layer of paint revealed something about the past, and how patience was often the most powerful tool. Julia listened with the ease of someone who didn't need to speak to understand. Her presence served as a kind of mirror reflecting just how far Clara had come. Not just in skill, but in self. Their shared moments were often wordless. Watching the sunset over the Adige River, sipping coffee on the small balcony outside Clara's kitchen, standing side by side in front of a centuries-old painting. And yet, beneath the surface of that silence, there was a current of quiet recognition, of everything that had been shed, and everything that was being rebuilt. One evening, as the city settled into the blue hush of dusk, Julia shared what Clara had already suspected. She, too, had left a relationship behind, one not marked by obvious cruelty, but by slow erosion. For years, she had adjusted herself in small ways, growing quieter, dimmer, until she could barely hear her own thoughts. It wasn't a dramatic ending, but a quiet decision to stop shrinking. Inspired in part by watching Clara do the same, Clara listened without interruption. The story didn't surprise her. She had seen it in Julia's eyes, in the way her shoulders had begun to lower, her voice to open. The weight that had once defined her was gone, replaced by something softer, braver. They moved through the city differently after that. Their conversations deepened, not just in memory but in vision. They spoke of things not just left behind but things still possible. Art projects Julia wanted to explore. Writing Clara had begun in secret. Spaces they wanted to shape with their own hands. The future had become not a question of what if but of what now. On Julia's final night in Verona, the two of them sat beneath a canopy of stars in a quiet courtyard, surrounded by the muffled sounds of evening. Clara felt no urgency to capture the moment. It didn't need preserving. It was already part of her. When morning came and they returned to the train station, there was no tearful goodbye. Just a long look, a shared understanding that they were no longer only survivors. They were creators of new lives, and this visit was not closure, but continuation. As the train pulled away and Clara turned back toward the city, she felt the weight of the past further lighten. Verona had given her solitude when she needed it, but it had also made room for connection, for old friendships to deepen, and for the kind of quiet transformation that becomes permanent not in grand declarations, but in simple, steady truths. It began without fanfare, as most real things do. Clara first noticed him during a lecture on fresco stabilization. He sat a few rows behind her, always quiet, always attentive. His name was Luca, a local artisan who had transitioned into restoration after years of architectural work. There was something grounded about him, not in the way he spoke. He rarely did, but in the way he observed. He asked few questions in class, but when he did, they were thoughtful, precise, quietly revealing a depth of care for the materials they worked with. Their first real conversation took place in the chapel, late one afternoon. She had stayed behind to catalog samples, and he had arrived to repair one of the ceiling's decorative cornices. Their tasks overlapped only slightly, but their silence didn't feel awkward. Instead, it was companionable. Each of them focused on their work, side by side in shared purpose. It wasn't until the light had begun to fade and they packed up their tools that he made a simple comment about the balance in her restoration technique. Not a compliment exactly, but an observation. Clear-eyed and unassuming. From that moment they began to notice one another differently. Not with urgency, but with attention. They shared small rituals. Exchanging coffee on early mornings in the studio, pausing to watch the changing light through the stained glass windows, offering each other quiet nods of acknowledgement after a long day. There was no rush to fill the spaces between words. No pressure to define what was forming. Clara was cautious. She had built her life in Verona piece by piece, shaping each decision with the care of someone who had once had no say at all. She was used to solitude now, and in many ways she found comfort in it. But Luca's presence didn't disrupt that. It folded into it. He never asked questions that felt invasive, never offered unsolicited advice, never tried to draw her out beyond what she was willing to share. He existed beside her, not over her. And yet, as the connection deepened, Clara found herself wrestling with an old tension. Not fear exactly, but memory, of how trust had once been used against her, how love had been repackaged as possession. There were moments when Luca's quiet attention stirred unease in her, not because he demanded anything, but because he didn't. Because the silence that had once felt safe now held possibility, and possibility was more frightening than solitude. One evening they stayed late after class to organize tools for an upcoming exhibition. As they worked, the hum of their conversation drifted from technique to travel to art that had moved them. Clara shared a story about a painting that had made her weep in Florence. Luca listened without interruption, then simply nodded as if to say, "I understand." When their hands brushed while closing a crate, Clara instinctively pulled away. He stepped back gently, giving space without retreating. That small moment stayed with her for days. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. There were no grand declarations, no sudden sparks. But there was something steady and true in the way he respected the boundaries she wasn't sure how to name. There was patience in his rhythm, a refusal to push. In that refusal, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: safety. Still, the question lingered. Could she open her heart again, even a little? Could she offer someone her presence without losing her own shape in the process? Clara didn't yet have the answer. But as the days passed and their quiet rituals continued, she began to understand that trust was not a door to fling open, but a window to crack slowly, letting in light a little at a time. For now that was enough. What they were building wasn't dramatic or defined. It was simply unfolding quietly between the silences, and Clara, for the first time in a long time, wasn't afraid to listen. The final strokes of the fresco restoration were almost imperceptible, gentle touches of pigment, subtle reinforcements to lines that had nearly vanished with time. Clara stepped back, brush in hand, and studied the wall she had come to know intimately. The figure in the center of the fresco, once blurred by centuries of decay, now stood whole again, luminous and quiet. There was no need for flourish. The beauty came from what had been carefully uncovered, not added. Standing there, Clara felt something settle within her. This project, so deeply tied to her own story, had become more than a task. It had been a reckoning, a conversation between the past and the present. Now, with the work complete, she found herself facing another restoration, one not of paint and plaster but of choice. The residency offer from New York still sat in her inbox, waiting. She had not yet responded. In the quiet space following the final day at the chapel, she returned to it. The opportunity was undeniable. Resources, visibility, professional advancement. A platform not just for her work, but for her voice. And yet, the path forward was not so easily drawn. Accepting meant returning, not only to the country she had left behind, but to the storm she had narrowly escaped. The media remained curious. The trial loomed ahead. Questions about her past might resurface. She would be seen in ways she could not control. Verona, by contrast, had offered her anonymity, then belonging. It had asked nothing from her but honesty and presence. It was here she had healed. Here she had stitched together the fragments of a self long overlooked. There was a quiet temptation to stay, to deepen roots, to continue the work she had begun, to let the life she had built stretch gently into the future without disruption. But Clara had not rebuilt herself to remain hidden. As she sat on her small balcony that evening, the view of the terracotta rooftops tinted by dusk, she thought not about what scared her, but what called to her. It wasn't the spotlight or the title. It was the chance to speak on her own terms, to show that survival was not the end of the story. Restoration was not just about fixing what was broken. It was about returning to essence, about clarity, about truth. She would accept the residency, but not as the woman once married to a criminal, not as someone who owed the world an explanation. She would go as the artist she had become, the one who had chosen herself in silence before anyone else believed she could. She closed her laptop and looked out at the darkening sky. The decision wasn't easy, but it was hers, and that made all the difference. In 2025, Clara's story resonates more deeply than ever in a world still reckoning with the quiet cost of emotional suppression and the complexity of starting over. Her journey is not just about leaving an abusive marriage. It's about reclaiming autonomy in a world that often confuses a woman's silence for contentment and her sacrifices for stability. Clara's transformation reminds us that healing is not always loud or linear. It can unfold gently, through self-trust, creative rediscovery, and the rebuilding of quiet routines. In a time when visibility and external validation seem more present than ever, where stories are often told for us through headlines, speculation, or digital noise, Clara teaches us the value of telling our story on our own terms. She doesn't act from vengeance or spectacle, but from intention. She doesn't speak to settle scores but to reclaim truth. For anyone navigating the aftermath of toxic relationships, workplace burnout, or emotional erasure, Clara's resilience encourages us to believe that it is not only possible to start again, but to do so with dignity and direction. What we must remember, though, is that healing doesn't erase history. Clara's scars aren't hidden. They're acknowledged, even integrated, just like the cracks in a restored fresco. And in 2025, as conversations around emotional abuse, financial control, and the right to personal reinvention become more nuanced and visible, her story serves as a quiet anthem for anyone rebuilding after being broken down. It reminds us that leaving is just the first step. The real transformation happens when we allow ourselves to create something new, even in the shadow of what was lost. Whether it's returning to an old passion, forming new relationships based on mutual respect, or simply choosing stillness over survival mode, Clara's story is a mirror for anyone ready to re-enter their life with agency. In a world that often demands we move on quickly or bounce back with polished strength, this story invites us to heal deeply, build slowly, and rise truthfully. What matters most isn't how loud the comeback is, but how real it feels.